Today I will be showing you how to use RaiseEvents in Photon. RaiseEvents are similar to RPCs, except you can have a few extra options, which could be useful if you want to have a little more flexibility, or if you want to drop packets. So to give you a good example of that is, let's say if you have a weapon in your game that fires bullets at a very high rate and you want to send those over the network, you don't necessarily want to use RPCs for that because it will clog up the traffic, as RPCs take priority to send first. Whereas if you use RaiseEvents, if there's too many packets going out or coming in, it will actually drop some of those and they won't send, which is how most shooters work. So the first part, I'm just going to set up a game object so that you can see what's going on as it's happening. I'm going to go into my scenes and open up the game scene right away. If you have not followed along to my previous tutorials, you can skip this part, but I'm going to move pretty quick just to get it out of the way. Okay, so in my hierarchy here, I'm going to create empty. I'm going to name it color sprite. I'm going to add a photon view, a sprite renderer, and I actually need to make a new script. I already made it here, but I'm going to delete it and start over so that you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to go to my scripts folder, make a new script. I'm going to call it color my sprite. It doesn't really matter, this is just an example. And then I will drag that onto my game object. And then I'm going to go to my resources and prefabs, which is where I store prefabs, which I will spawn over the network. And I'm just going to drag color sprite into that. Also, we'll have to change the name of the object which is spawned when you connect. So that's done in the player network script. So if you don't have that open yet, go ahead and open it up. It should be on line 92, or if you're doing your own project, wherever you are instantiating objects. And I'm just going to change that to my prefab, which I already forgot the name of, color sprite. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and save. I should probably actually enlarge this. I need to actually set a sprite as well, so I'm gonna go to the sprite property in the sprite renderer. And I'm just going to use one of the default ones, so the UI sprite, which is kind of like a square. And then I'm going to change the scaling up a bit so that you can see it. Let's do 64 by 64 for my camera, so it's really visible. There we go. And I'm going to apply so that it saves to the prefab. And I'm going to delete this from my scene and then go back to the main scene. And I don't need to save anything, so I'm going to hit don't save. Okay, so I'm going to go to my scripts folder and open up the color my sprite script which we just created. And on top, I'm going to do require component type of sprite renderer because it needs that component to work. I'm going to, under the awake method, I am going to find my sprite renderer and assign it to a variable. So let me go ahead and make that variable of type sprite renderer. I'm just going to call it m_sprite renderer. I'm going to find it here. So the first thing I'm going to do is write the code so that I know it's working locally. So I'm going to delete start. I don't need that. I'm going to just write the code under the update. Okay, so I'm going to do this every time my spacebar is pressed, so I'm going to do it when it's pressed down and not when it's held. So I'm going to do get key down, key code dot space, and I'm just going to make a couple floats called RBG, and I'm going to assign these random values between 0 and 1, and that's going to generate our color. So I'm going to do r equals random dot range 0f 1f, and I'm actually going to copy this part right, whoops, so it's supposed to be random dot range. I'm going to copy this, just do b paste g paste just to make it quick. And then once I have the color generated, or the float values, I'm going to set my sprite renderer dot color property to be a new color using those values. Go ahead and save your script and then go back to Unity. Okay, so assuming you had the prefab set up and you have that the colored sprite should spawn as the prefab, it should appear when I join the room. So I'm going to go ahead and make a room, and there it is. So I'm going to hit spacebar, and you can see that the color is changing. So that is indeed working as intended. So now we have to wire it up to use Photon RaiseEvents. So go ahead and hit the play button to get back to the main scene, and let's go back to the script. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this code in a new method. I'm just going to call it private void new color, and I'm just going to take all of this and paste it in there. And I'm going to change my spacebar to call new color. Now keep in mind, you only want to perform actions, typically perform actions on Photon views that you own. So I need to check if I own the Photon view on this object. So in order to do that quickly, I'm going to change where it says mono behavior and just put Photon dot in front. That way I can access the base class, which has a Photon view component or reference. I'm going to do base.photonView that is mine. So if that is true, only then will I check for keyboard inputs to change the color. So in my new color method here, I'm going to actually change, we'll actually remove this line right here where I set the color, because the color is going to be set over the network and not locally. So I'm going to delete that, but I'm going to keep the other values. Now to send data over a RaiseEvent, you have to pull it as an array. Unlike RPCs where you can add in values individually, so like player, this is going to give me a bunch of errors because I'm just typing it randomly. Actually, let me comment here. So like player, damage value, etc. You can't just pass them into the method like that. You actually have to pull them into a single array and then send that in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do object as an array, datas equals new object, and I'm just going to add in RBG. So it has an array type of datas, and it has in these values. You could make a float array if you want, but I'm going to be passing in multiple value types later on, so that's why I am using an object. So the API says to call this, I need to type in Photon network.RaiseEvent, and I have to use an event code, which I'm just going to put 0 for now. We will go back to that very shortly. The event content is going to be my datas, which is the array. Send reliable. This is what I was talking about earlier. If you want to drop packets or potentially drop packets if the network's being overloaded, you would set this to false. And this is typically where you're going to use RaiseEvent for. Now you also have your RaiseEvent options. This is kind of similar to room options. You don't necessarily have to use them, but I would specify at least the basics. So I have this set up right now as is, but we're going to make some changes. First, I'm going to make custom options. So I'm going to RaiseEvent options. Options equals new RaiseEvent options. And there's 2 fields I specifically want to change. To get a list of fields I can use, I'm just going to hit space. Caching options, I'm going to do equals event caching dot do not cache. Basically, I don't want this to be stored anywhere on the server in memory or anything like that. I want it to go off and then be forgotten about. So I'm going to say do not cache. And you notice I put a comma there and not a semicolon because we're still building onto it. So I'm going to hit space again. Receivers. This is kind of like Photon targets in an RPC. So receiver group dot, and I'm going to do all so that this fires on all clients plus the one sending it. And there are more options that I will quickly talk about. So you have encrypt, whether you want to encrypt the event or not. Forward webhook, I haven't actually looked into. You'll want to read the API. Interest group is kind of like the groups when you send RPCs. It's the very last parameter, which you don't have to necessarily use, but you can. And sequence groups, I have not looked into, but it looks like you can just set a priority on the packet. And target actors. Now, if you've used Unreal Engine, you'll know that an actor is kind of like a game object in Unity. This is not what that is. This is actually targeting player IDs. So it's kind of like in adjacent to who you're sending it to. As you can see, it says a list of Photon player.ids to send this event to. So don't mistake that for which game objects you're sending it to. It's actually which players you're sending it to. In this case, I'm not going to touch that. I'm only going to use the first two. So I'm going to remove that last comma right there. So comma on the first line, gone on the second. And the semicolon at the end. And I'm going to change my null to use my options. Something else I'd like to do is to give the event code a name. 0 is kind of vague, and if you have a lot of these going around, it's going to get confusing pretty quick. So I'm going to go up to the top here, below where I have my namespaces, and I'm going to make an enum. I'm going to call it Photon Event Codes. I'm going to do color change equals 0. And just as an example, what another one might look like, I'll just do health update equals 1. It's very important that these have numbers and that the numbers are unique. It doesn't really matter what they are, but they are bytes. They have to be bytes, so at most 256. Otherwise you'll get an overflow. So I have those. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to type in Photon event codes dot color change. And you're going to get an error because it expects a byte. So I'm just going to cast that to a byte and you're good. At this point it's raising the event, but I'm not doing anything when that event is received. So nothing will happen if I actually run it at this point. So what I need to do is I need to listen for the event for when it's called. So I'm going to go private void on enable and Photon network dot on event call. Let's do plus equals, and I'm going to hit, oh, it doesn't actually work. Sometimes if you do plus equals and then tab, you can have it automatically fill out the parameters needed. In this case, it's not working. So I'm just going to do plus equals on Photon event, and you're going to get an error because that doesn't exist. So let me make that real quick. Looking at the API, it expects you to have the event code, the content, and the sender ID. And now the error is gone. So I'm also going to do this for on disable, except I'm going to remove the events. You don't necessarily have to do this. Well, you definitely have to do the one where you listen, where you bind to it, but you don't necessarily have to do the one where you remove it. If you want stuff to still call on your game object even when it's disabled, you will not add this line of code. Another thing I'm unsure of is if Photon events will actually call on a disabled object. I have not tried that, so that might be worth investigating. So where event codes come in handy or when they're important is this method will call no matter what event is sent. So if you have a bunch of these floating around, this is going to call every time one of those issues. So that's why it's really important to have event codes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do Photon event codes code equals Photon event codes event code. So I'm just casting the byte to my enum. And I'm going to do if code equals color change. So if this is a color change code, we're going to process the logic below. If you haven't saved in a while, go ahead and do so now. The first thing you have to do is you have to make your content back into an array. So I'm going to do object datas equals content as object. So if you pass this in as like a float, this would be float datas equals content as float instead. Now I know that I'm passing in 3 datas for this event. So I am going to do if datas.length equals 3, run the logic below. I do not want it to run the logic if the data is not the proper length. I'm just going to go ahead and update my sprite renderer color based on the received datas. So equals new color, and keep in mind they're objects, so you have to actually cast them to the proper format. So data's O or 0, data's 1, and lastly data's 2. And they'll be received in the same order they're sent. So this is basically RG or RBG, which I got the order wrong, which is normally listed in most color applications, but it's irrelevant, it doesn't matter because this is just an example. So I'm setting the color based on the datas and I'm casting. Certain types of data might require different cast types or conversions, so keep that in mind if you're having problems with stuff coming in incorrectly. So I'm going to save, and then I'm going to go back to my project. I didn't have any errors, which is good, so I'm going to hit play. And once it joins the lobby, I'm just going to make a room, log in, and I'm going to press spacebar. So it's changing the color now, and it's passing over the network. So we know that the data is indeed getting to us over the network, so that's good. So I'm going to hit stop and then make a quick build to show you something. I hit build and run, by the way, so that's what's going on right now. I'm going to hit play in my editor as well. I'm going to make a quick room, joining it, starting it up. Okay, so I have 2 different sprite game objects here, which is to be expected because it's 2 different clients. Now, I only have this window right here selected. Now I hit space, it's changing the color on both of them when I only want to change the color on one of these objects, the one I'm pressing it for. So let's go ahead and close out of this and go back to the code. So this is getting back to the part where I said I know I'm going to pass in extra information. So I'm going to go back to new color, and where I have datas, I'm actually going to add in base.photonView.viewID. The view ID is unique across all players, so it's going to be the same for player 1 as it is 2, 3, and 4, etc. per game object. So now I'm passing in the view ID along with the RBG values. So going back up, my data length is actually now going to be 4 because I added in the extra value. And instead of just setting this right away, I'm going to check if the view matches. So I know that the Photon view ID is an int because I'm hovering over it and it says int. So I'm going to do if int data's 0 equals base.photonView.viewID, execute this code. Basically saying if the view ID is my own, then execute this code. If you want it to fire on all game objects of this type, regardless of if it's the one calling it, you don't need to do this check, and you don't need to include it. Now that I added that extra variable in, though, I have to change these up by 1. So I'm going to, instead of 0, 1, and 2, it's going to be 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to go ahead and save and then go back to my editor. I'm going to do another build. I'm going to launch the editor as well. Making a room, joining it, starting. Okay, I have both in the room now. So back to having this window selected only again, I'm going to hit space. And this particular window owns the bottom sprite, and you can see that the bottom one is only changing now. So if I go back to my editor and hit space, I see the top one's changing. It's a brown right now. You can see that it's a brown on that one as well. So I'm going to try and drag it over here so you can see both change at the same time. As you can see, it is updating live. And that's all there is to events. If you have any questions, like always, leave a comment and I will definitely try to help out.